Hey guys, it's Madison Estes. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a horror movie binge. I haven't been super happy with a lot of the films that have come out this year. Honestly, 2023 has been a little bit disappointing so far. So I compiled a list at the end of last year of all of the horror movies that people recommended, and I finally got around to watching most of those the last couple of months. So I'm just gonna do a really quick review on several of these films so that if you're like me and you kind of feel like we're going through a dry spell in terms of quality horror films, you'll have something to watch. Not all of these films are great. In fact, there's quite a few that I think are just good, and then there's some that I actually wouldn't recommend watching, but I'm just gonna review everything that was on my list. So the first film I want to talk about is Bodies, 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 that stars Pete Davidson. I thought this was a really fun horror film. It was one that had been high on my list to see last year, but for some reason I never got around to it. But I'm really glad that I did, because it was a really fun whodunit mystery, and the ending was just wow, it was so surprising. This movie is about a group of young adults that play a game called Bodies, 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 where you go around making accusations, trying to figure out who's the person that committed the murder. Only in this case, they end up with a real dead body, and the bodies start piling up, and they have to figure out who the real killer is. Now, this might be a little bit of a cheat, because I wouldn't really say that it was a horror film, even though it was marketed that way. It's definitely more of a mystery thriller, although there are a bunch of bodies that begin piling up, so I guess you could call it a slasher, but regardless of how you want to categorize it, I think that it's a really fun film. It has a lot of goofy humor in it, and I give that film 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is The Menu with Anna Taylor-Joy. This movie is about a bunch of eccentric rich people that go to an island so that they can eat at this really high-end fancy restaurant that only serves a very limited number of people every night. So the chef and his staff turn out to be not quite what you would expect. The chef has a personal vendetta against every single person that he invited except for Anna Taylor-Joy, and he doesn't quite know what to do with her. This was a really fun film. If I have any complaints about it, I think it's that they raised the stakes a little bit too soon. Stakes, not those stakes. I do feel like there's a couple things they could have kept us in the dark about a little bit longer, but I really enjoyed the tension in this film. I really liked the cat and mouse game between Anna Taylor-Joy's character and the chef. I like the themes on classism. I like the fact that the main villain not only has a vendetta against all these people, but he also recognizes the ways in which he's a hypocrite and wants to punish himself as well. And I thought that that was really interesting, and it added a little bit of nuance to the villain. Overall, I enjoyed it a lot. I did think that it got a little bit silly at the end. There was a couple things that I rolled my eyes at, but overall it was still a good time. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. The next film I want to talk about is The Invitation, and I believe you can watch this film at Netflix at this time. It's about a woman whose mother passes away and she has no other known relatives, so she decides to do a DNA test to try to find some extended family members. She discovers a long-lost cousin who invites her to come to a wedding on the English countryside, and she falls in love with the guy that's hosting the event, who she's not related to. I feel like I should probably clarify that. And of course, because this is a gothic horror film, she begins to uncover secrets about her newfound family and about the guy that she's developing feelings for. So I think the worst thing about this film is that it is fairly predictable. I kind of called most of the major twists, but there were a few things that were surprising, and overall, it's just a fun, slow burn horror film. I don't think I'll ever watch it again, and I don't think it was particularly memorable, but it was a good time. It was a good time. I enjoyed it. I didn't have super high expectations going into it, and you shouldn't either, but I do think that this will kind of satisfy that itch if you're craving a nice gothic horror film. I give it 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I want to talk about a film that people lost their minds over last year. They thought it was so great. So many people said it was their favorite film of the year, and that movie is Speak No Evil. It's currently streaming on Shudder, so I thought, hey, I'll check it out. It was okay. I liked it. I felt like it had a very slow beginning, and it was frustrating to watch at times because the couple was just so obnoxiously compliant. And I do understand that's the point of the film, but sometimes it got to be a little too much for me. So it's about this couple that meets another couple while they're on vacation, and they become buddies. And then one of the couples invites the other one to come visit them at their house and stay with them. Obviously, this couple does not have good intentions, and you watch as the other couple slowly but surely begins to have their boundaries pushed, and they give in every single time and let the other couple have their way and let them kind of walk all over them. It is an interesting film in that it kind of shows you that there is such a thing as being too accommodating and that there is a downside to people pleasing, but I did feel as though it dragged quite a bit. And most of the horror in this film is psychological. For instance, there's a scene where you see the father yelling at his own son, like screaming at him, telling him he's not good enough, and just really being very emotionally abusive. And the other couple just sits and watches this, and they do end up speaking up a little bit, on the boy's behalf, but not enough. And it's just a really well done, uncomfortable scene. Also, there's another scene where the couple's daughter, I forgot to mention they have kids, kind of important, the daughter crawls into bed with the other couple, and the dad is not wearing any clothes, and the couple's like, upset by this, and they bring it up, and then the other couple's like, well, why didn't your kid come into your bedroom? And just completely unapologetic about the fact that the father was nude. And I'm just like, why would you even put up with that? Like, as soon as I looked for my kid and I saw them in the bed with a dude that wasn't dressed, we would have been out of the house. I wouldn't have even said 2 more words to that couple. Like, it's just, yeah, there's quite a few moments like that where I'm like, I understand this is supposed to be a commentary on compliance and people pleasing, but sometimes it just went way too far for me, to the point that I'm like, most rational people would not behave in this way, and it was very frustrating. I do think that like the last 20 minutes of this film were really riveting, because the couple finally figures out that these are bad people and they try to get away from them. And that was really interesting, if not a little bit predictable. But there was some very graphic horror scenes that I thought were really interesting and a bit horrifying, honestly. And I think that that's what got everybody talking about this film. And I think that's the part that people remember about this film, not the incredibly boring 60 to 70 minutes leading up to the last part of the film. There's one scene in particular, I won't get into details, but they do something very horrible to the daughter, and I think that that's the scene that most people are going to remember from this film. It's definitely the one that has left an impression on me. So even though this was a flawed film, and it definitely had some parts that aggravated me, there were some really good horrifying scenes towards the end of this film, and I definitely understand why people talk so much about this film. I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Okay, I think this is the first film I'm going to talk about that I just don't recommend watching at all. In fact, this might be one of the worst films on this list, and that movie is Men. I was really disappointed with this movie. So many people raved it was their favorite film of the year, so I went in with some pretty high expectations, and I would say about 15 minutes into the film, I lowered those expectations substantially, and I was like, okay, I just hope that I enjoy this film somewhat. And I have to say, it just got more and more boring. It's about a woman that goes on a solo vacation to an English countryside after her husband commits suicide. They had a very toxic, tumultuous relationship, so she has some mixed feelings about him being gone. And she begins being stalked by a man, and then she ends up seeing that man's face everywhere she goes. Every time she goes into town, she sees different people that appear to have the same face as this man. I know it sounds like a really interesting premise, and so many cool things could have been done here, but unfortunately, it's just a lot of just nothingness. Because the movie is called Men, I'm assuming there's supposed to be some kind of feminist theme that's supposed to be running through this. I have noticed that the female main character tends to get gaslighted a lot by different people in the town. I'm not quite sure if that was supposed to be building up to something or if it's just supposed to be saying, hey, men suck. I'm not sure. And there's another scene where the priest starts talking to her, and you think that he's, giving her emotional support, and then he just turns on her and he's like, calling her an awful human being and just being really inappropriate. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but even that kind of just seemed to be dropped and it didn't really go anywhere. It was a lot of just nothingness until the last 5 minutes, where we saw a really cool scene that didn't really make any sense in the film, not on a subtext level, not on a literal level, where some man appears to be like barfing up another man. I wasn't sure what that was trying to say on a symbolic level, and by that point I was so bored and frustrated with the film, I didn't care. I was just like, oh, that's kind of cool. And that's also, again, probably the reason why most people talked about this film, because it had one interesting scene. So if you are curious about this film, I would recommend just fast forwarding to the last 10 minutes and just watching the last 10 minutes of the film. I give it 1.5 out of 5 stars. On to a much better film. This is another film that got a lot of positive reviews. In fact, I think this is the one that ended up in most people's top 10 lists, top 5 lists of the year. It was almost everyone's favorite film, and I didn't see it until this year, and that movie is Pearl. Pearl is about a woman that is trapped with her parents on an isolated farm, and she dreams of being a big star. She wants to be in the movies, she wants to be a dancer, she has all these big dreams of being famous, but she feels as though she is held back by her circumstances. I really enjoyed this film a lot. There's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of the plot because the majority of it is just her, trying to pursue her dreams and then the setbacks that follow. But it's just a really good character-driven film. There's a lot of scenes that are just slightly disturbing, like the scene where she's with the scarecrow, or just kind of uncomfortable. But, the film progressively gets a little bit darker and darker until she ends up doing some pretty horrible things. I think I ended up putting X on my list of top 5 horror movies of last year, and I think if I could reorganize the list, I'd probably replace X with Pearl. That's how much I enjoyed this film. I think my favorite scene of the entire movie is the one where she's talking to her friend at the kitchen table and just the emotional and mental breakdown that she has when she's talking to her friend. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. This is one of the few horror films that I saw that came out last year that I absolutely must see again at some point. And the ending, oh my gosh, yeah, that was very surprising to me. For a moment, I just kind of sat there like, that's it, that's the film. But I don't know, then it just kind of like, there's just something about it, like her stare, that's just really fascinating in retrospect, and it makes me want to watch it again already. So really enjoyed this film a lot. I give Pearl 5 out of 5 stars. Next up is the movie Tethered. I saw this movie on quite a few people's lists last year. So this movie is about a blind teenage boy who lives in seclusion in the woods, and he's able to navigate his surroundings by tying a rope around himself so that he doesn't get too far away from his cabin. And he survives by fishing, foraging, and hunting small animals. He also has a tape recording that has certain rules he has to follow, one of which being every time he kills something in the forest to eat, he needs to kill 2 and leave 1 for the forest. So he needs to leave an animal sacrifice at the edge of the woods, which happens to be pretty much the end of his rope as far as he can move without, the rope pulling him back. The second rule is that whenever he's losing hope, he must sing their song, which now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not 100% sure how that played into anything in the movie. And then the third rule is that no matter what, he must never ever let go of the rope. So I thought the first third of this film was pretty interesting, just setting up the premise, the strange rules that follow, him being raised by his mom, how they both manage to survive in this environment. And then it kind of starts to get a little bit mundane. You start getting some really repetitive shots. And then a visitor ends up appearing and, that the boy has to interact with. And it kind of shakes up his whole world because he's not used to being around people anymore. And then that's kind of interesting for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then again, it starts to get really repetitive and monotonous. That's the greatest weakness of this film by far, is that it suffers from a very slow pacing. This was originally a short film, and you can tell sometimes short films are able to be adapted into longer films, but usually it's because they add a lot more plot to it. In this case, it felt like a short film that someone was trying to pad. I did like the ending. I thought it was interesting, but I don't think that the payoff was worth the incredibly long wait. Although it had some good acting and a good premise, it was just way too slow and it needed to have more plot. I give Tethered 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is a film that actually wasn't on anyone's list. I just stumbled across it whenever I was on Tubi, and this film is called Play Dead. Play Dead is about a girl whose brother was involved in a robbery where somebody got shot and killed, so she fakes her own death in order to get access to a morgue so that she can get the evidence that could be used against him and destroy it. Because apparently this is like a small town and they store the dead bodies next to the same place they store evidence in crimes, I guess. Well, the evidence in question is a dead man's cell phone, so I guess it's feasible to believe that they would put his belongings into like a bag or something and that it would stay at the morgue. It's possible, okay? It's somewhat believable. If you can't believe that, you're gonna have some problems with this film, but luckily for me, I'm getting much better at suspending my disbelief for the sake of an interesting film. There's a few other things that happen in this story that you're just gonna be like, that's not how that works. But I felt like it was believable enough, and it was fun, and it was satisfying. And the guy who is the main villain in this story was very creepy. And I really enjoyed it a lot. And it's a wild ride. There's a lot of twists in this film. Some of them are very predictable, but some of them surprised me and I did not see them coming. There's a couple of moments in the film where if you know anything about what they're doing in the film, and I don't want to give any spoilers away so I won't say what happened, but If you know anything about it, you're gonna be like, that wouldn't actually work in real life. But, just again, for the sake of a good story, I think it's believable enough and I enjoyed it. Just don't overanalyze the plot too much. I give Play Dead 3 out of 5 stars. Next up is Escape the Field, now on Peacock. If you are an escape room junkie like me, I think you're really gonna like this film. 6 strangers wake up in a remote, endless cornfield with 6 items. A gun with a single bullet, matches, a lantern, a knife, a compass, and a flask with water. They start hearing mysterious sirens and they realize that someone or something is hunting them, and they also encounter some booby traps in this corn maze. In order to escape, they're going to have to work together with the items they've been given in order to solve this diabolical puzzle. You can definitely see some influences of other films in this, such as Cube, In the Tall Grass, and Escape Room, but I loved it. By any means, this is not a great film. I didn't feel like the cinematography was all that great. Some of the acting was also a bit subpar. The writing might have been a little bit cheesy at times, but I really enjoyed this film. It just checks a lot of boxes for me. I love strangers waking up in a strange place and trying to figure out what happened to them. I love the trope where they have to work together in order to survive. I love all the mysterious aspects of it, like waking up with all of the strange items. It's really cool. And unlike a lot of other films in this genre, which I'm not really sure what you'd call this genre, like strangers that wake up in a strange location with amnesia and have to figure out what happened to them, a lot of those movies fall apart in the third act, and I felt like this one did not. Now, I don't think that it does anything super unique or interesting, otherwise I probably would have made a separate video just for this film. I do feel like it follows some pretty familiar beats along the lines of, Cube and Escape Room. Overall, I give Escape the Field 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is Resurrection. A lot of people talked about this movie, but why this movie was on anyone's list, I have no idea. Honestly, I have trouble even explaining the film because it was so boring and went nowhere. So I'm just gonna read the synopsis because I can't even explain the film. It's a woman goes around being miserable for 2 hours. A woman's carefully constructed life gets upended when an unwelcome shadow from her past returns, forcing her to confront the monster she's evaded for 2 decades. So yeah, even the synopsis is just generic as hell. There's a weird scene at the end, and I've noticed a lot of these films that turned out to not be very good films, but have like 1 or 2 really gross or weird scenes at the end end up being like smash hits, because that's all anyone remembers, I guess. I don't know, but I was so bored throughout the entire film. By the time I got to the ending, I was just like so fed up, and the ending did nothing for me anyways in this case. I barely even remember it. So this one is just a full-on, a hard no, definitely pass. I give Resurrection 1 out of 5 stars. Next up is a horror film that doesn't really have a lot of horror elements to it, but it is indeed a horror film, or at least dark fantasy. I enjoyed this film so much, even though the parts that I loved are not the horror parts. So don't go into this film expecting this to be super gory or horrifying. That's not why I saved this one for last. I saved it for last because it's a very solid film that I love, probably more than any other film on this list, and it's one that I'll definitely be watching again. This film is called All the Moons. This movie is about a little girl that lives in an orphanage that gets bombed during a war, and she ends up on death's door pretty quickly. A woman with supernatural powers saves her life and gives the girl immortality and becomes her mother. Unfortunately, the mother and daughter are being hunted by people that would like to see them killed, and they end up separated. The rest of the movie is just about this girl trying to navigate through life because the superpowers that she was given also gives her weaknesses, and she's just trying to get by and find an adult that will take care of her and become her family. It's a visually stunning film, and it's a character-driven story that definitely reminds me of other movies like Let the Right One In and Pan's Labyrinth. The ending had me almost in tears at moments. It was just so good. I really enjoyed this one a lot, and I give All the Moons 5 out of 5 stars. So if you've seen any of these films, I would love to know what you thought, or if you're planning on seeing any of them now, I would love to know which ones interested you. Also, if you have any recommendations for good horror films that you've seen in the last couple of years, please leave a comment in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and be sure to subscribe. On this channel, I post reviews, writing advice, horror commentary, and vlogs. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later.